Hello and welcome to my fabulous channel. In the month of October, we're going to be celebrating one of my favorite holidays, Halloween. Growing up in Brazil, I would see all these movies and have the kids going trick-or-treating and the costumes and everything. So when I moved here, that was one of the holidays that I was looking for the most. Would I say looking forward or looking forward?
Looking forward to the most.
So when I moved here, it became one of the holidays that I was looking forward to the most. And to kick off our Halloween celebration, we're going to be talking about a vitamin deficiency. Yes, ma'am, you heard it right. A vitamin deficiency. Did you know that there's a lot of interesting connections between a dietary deficiency of niacin or vitamin B3 and the vampire myth? Niacin is part of a few molecules that are super important for our body to function, such as the NAD and the NADP. For you to have an idea, over 400 enzymes need NAD to catalyze their reactions in our body, including some very important reactions that produce energy inside our cells. Niacin plays an important role in skin integrity and regeneration, and is also super important for brain function. Severe niacin deficiency leads to a disease called pellagra, which is the focus of today's mystical talk. Pellagra was first recognized in 1735, and it plagued Europe and the United States for over 200 years. It still happens in some parts of the world, but it has mostly been eradicated. And the interesting thing about pellagra is that it was associated with corn. After corn was brought over to Europe from America, it quickly became a staple food, especially for poor people. And where corn went, pellagra followed. And this happened because the niacin and the tryptophan is an amino acid that can be converted into niacin in our bodies. So both the niacin and the tryptophan in corn are bound to proteins, so our bodies can't really properly digest and absorb it. And since corn was a staple food within the native populations in America, you might ask, why weren't they all developing pellagra too? When you boil the corn with an alkali agent such as potassium hydroxide present in wood ash or calcium hydroxide present in mineral lime, which was a practice that could be traced in several of the native populations, you free up the niacin and the tryptophan, which I found to be brilliant. And there is some data suggesting that the colonists did notice that they would do that they would add the wood ash and the mineral lime to the corn that they were preparing, but they thought that was just for taste, not so brilliant. But how all of this relates to vampire at all? I found this super interesting article by Jeffrey Hempe that compares the clinical manifestations of pellagra with the characteristics described by Bram Stoker in his novel Dracula. Even though Dracula was technically a work of fiction released in 1897, Stoker did a lot of folklore research before writing the book, so it does have some historical value to it. Hempe explains that pellagra is clinically identified by the 4 Ds. I forgot the first D. Hempe explains that pellagra is clinically identified by the 4 Ds. Dermatitis, diarrhea. Hempe explains that pellagra is clinically identified by the 4 Ds. Dermatitis, dementia, diarrhea, and death. Let's go ahead and break them down and see how it relates to vampires at all. D number 1, dermatitis. This is probably the most interesting one. Just like in the vampire myth, people that have pellagra are extremely sensitive to the sun. The areas of the skin exposed to the sun turn bright red, and then they get scaly and browned, and it literally looks like the sun just burned them. This also causes edema and inflammation. eventually turning the skin depigmented with patches of scaly areas. And with time, the skin becomes paper thin. In Dracula, the vampire is described as a super pale individual who only comes out at night. The author also mentions that there was not a speck of color in Dracula, and he had a bloated face. Still within the realm of dermatitis comes glossitis, which is an inflammation of the tongue. It basically turns the tongue super red and swollen, which resembles blood, but that seems a little bit outlandish to me. And also the edema creates some indentions in the tongue, making it seem that the person has bigger and sharper teeth. Let's go to D number 2, dementia. Since niacin is required for the brain cells to function, with the deficiency, eventually they start dying out and degenerating, causing dementia. The clinical symptoms are of the manic aggressive type, also super characteristic of the folkloric vampire. They include insomnia, depression, aggression, and anxiety. The author suggests that the insomnia, combined with the aggression, might have created a fear in the villagers at a time of a nighttime attack. D number 3, diarrhea. While diarrhea itself was not explicitly mentioned in the vampire folklore, some other GI alterations do exist. Pellagra often causes anorexia and weight loss. The food refusal can be justified by all the lesions that happen in the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, and in the colon of those who struggle with the disease. All these lesions can eventually lead to dysphagia, which is a difficulty swallowing. In the book, Dracula often apologizes for not eating, and one of the other characters actually says that they could not physically eat, that the idea of food was repulsive to them. Let's go to the last D, D number 4, death. Historically, the vampires were identified by a wasting disease. The folklore says that those who would die from this disease and had unfinished business with family or friends would come back for revenge. Now, if someone died from pellagra during that time, one could imagine that the rest of the people that live with them or live around them, their family and friends, would have a similar niacin deficient diet, right? So they would start developing the symptoms too, and they would start saying that it was the revenge from the vampire. In the folklore, the vampires would drain the vitality of their victims in the form of blood. Now, with all the GI lesions that happen with pellagra, there's a lot of bleeding associated. And with that bleeding, the people with pellagra could also develop anemia, which would also support the idea that they are taking away the vitality in form of blood. Now listen, this could all be coincidental. There's a lot of different diseases that could cause similar symptoms, but it does make for an interesting case, doesn't it? Now all this talk has got me thirsty, excuse me. And now we're coming to the end of another video. It is fabulous, spooky out here, and we would love to have you. So please consider subscribing, hitting the like button, and be on the lookout for another gorgeous Halloween video. Bye!